Hi, everybody. Welcome to our third in a series of conversations about the 2020 elections and its aftermath. For those of you who were with us in the fall, we started back in a long time, what feels like a long time ago now, in October, with a conversation that situated the US context in a wider global and comparative frame. And we discussed the relationship between popular politics in the streets and the ballot box. Our second conversation thought through democratic governance institutions, including parties, the judiciary, corporations, and unions. This third conversation will be surveying the post-election landscape. Where are we now? What possibilities are on the horizon? What are the structural configurations of American politics that inhibit transformative politics? Before I introduce our panelists for today, I want to first thank those who make this possible from behind the scenes, especially Anna Jones and Carlo Diaz at the 3CT, as well as Joe Bonney at SSD and the rest of his staff. I also want to remind everyone that 3CT will be hosting a graduate student organized conference titled Anti-Politics, From New Anarchisms to the Alt-Right, which will take place virtually on February 26th and 27th. And deadlines for abstracts for those of you who would want to submit is in 2 weeks on January 29th. And a link should be available in the chat for those interested. So now to our panelists for today, and I'll be introducing them in the order that they will speak. First, we'll have Aziz Rana. Aziz is the Richard and Lois Cole Professor of Law at Cornell Law School. His research and teaching center on American constitutional law and political development, with a particular focus on how shifting notions of race, citizenship, and empire have shaped legal and political identity since the founding. His first book, The Two Faces of American Freedom, situates the American experience within the global history of colonialism, examining the intertwined relationship in American constitutional practice between internal accounts of freedom and external projects of power and expansion. His current book manuscript explores the modern rise of constitutional veneration in the 20th century, especially against the backdrop of growing American global authority and how such veneration has influenced the boundaries of popular politics. He's also written essays and op-eds for venues such as N+1, Boston Review, Dissent, the New Labor Forum, Guardian, Jacobin, Chronicle for Higher Ed, The Nation, and New York Times. Second, we'll have Sheila Jasanoff. Sheila is Pforzheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at Harvard's Kennedy School. Her work explores the role of science and technology in the law, politics, and policy of modern democracies. She founded and directs the STS program at Harvard, and previously she was founding chair of the STS department at Cornell. A pioneer in her field, her books include The Fifth Branch, Science at the Bar, Designs on Nature, The Ethics of Invention, and Can Science Make Sense of Life? Jasanoff has served on the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Board of Directors and as president of the Society for Social Studies of Science. She's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Her honors include the SSRC's Hirschman Prize, the Humboldt Foundation's Reimer Lust Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and several others. Last but not least, we'll have Astra Taylor. Astra is a filmmaker, writer, and political organizer. She's the director of the philosophical documentaries, What is Democracy?, Examined Life, and Zizek. She's also the author of the American Book Award winner, The People's Platform, Taking Back Power and Culture in the Digital Age, and Democracy May Not Exist, but We Will Miss It When It's Gone. Astra is a co-founder of the Debt Collective, a debtors union that seeks to creatively redeploy the tools of collective labor organizing and bargaining to build power against creditors. More recently, she is the co-author of Can't Pay, Won't Pay, The Case for Economic Disobedience and Debt Abolition, which is out now from Haymarket Books. So ask the panelists to turn on their videos, and we'll start with Aziz.
Great. So the first thing I'd like to do is just say, thank you for the invitation. Thank you to Adom and Anna, Carlos, Joe, and everybody else who was involved in putting this together. So for my time, and I think we're supposed to speak for something like 15 to 20 minutes, I'd like to talk a little bit with the last couple months in American life, from essentially November 3rd to early January with the attack on the Capitol as a backdrop, about the relationship between constitutionalism and what we can broadly call authoritarianism in American life. And today feels like a particularly apt date to do it, given that it's Martin Luther King's actual birthday. And what I want to do is kind of reflect on, I think, the limitations of what has been the traditional account of the relationship between the two. So the traditional account, which really emerges in the context of World War II and the Cold War, pits authoritarianism, American-style constitutionalism against authoritarianism by saying the basic problem for the country is the problem of populism or tyranny of the majority. And that the way that you ensure against having demagogues use sort of overarching majorities to produce authoritarian outcomes is by really investing in the American constitutional system's checks and balances. So everything from the Senate to federalism to the nature of the Supreme Court is supposed to be a constraint on the ways in which demagogic majorities, sort of populistic majorities, can produce authoritarian outcomes. And, my own position is that this gets it exactly wrong. Really, the history of authoritarianism in the US, of an authentically domestic American-style authoritarianism, is the history of empowered minority, in particular, a very specific kind of white racial minority that's empowered, using the tools, the counter-majoritarian tools of the constitutional order to sustain authoritarian power. And what that means is that the story in the US of authoritarianism is really the story of the relationship, the kind of continuous and intricate relationship between constitutionalism and authoritarianism, and also, and perhaps equally surprising, between constitutionalism and violence, the ways in which constitutionalism, American-style constitutionalism, actually feeds violent reaction and lawlessness, and so that the two are not juxtaposed as oppositional. And I'd like to work through this through two kind of short historical overviews. So one is a history of the last, let's say, 40 years and the rise and fall of the Reagan coalition. The second is a broader history of what we can think of as American settler colonialism and the particular ways in which the US has empowered specific racial insiders at the same time as disempowering various excluded and outsider communities, and how that ties to the constitutional system. And then I'd like to end with some reflections on what that means for the present as like an agenda for change, and where specifically left political activism should fit as part of that agenda. Okay, so let me start with the shorter history. I think it's really important to make sense of this present, to appreciate the extent to which conservatism was really the dominant political formation in American life in, let's say, the last quarter to third of the 20th century. By this, I mean that the Republican Party, as the repository of American conservatism, had a majority coalition. It had an incredibly charismatic president in the form of Reagan. It dominated presidential politics between 1968 and 1992. It transformed, as a result, the nature of the Supreme Court. It won landslide political elections. 1972's victory for Nixon, 1984's victory for Reagan. These are landslide victories for the right. And they're, of course, like two kind of interrelated reasons. Like one has to do with the very different demographics of the country, the extent to which the country was less multiracial, multi-ethnic than it is today. But it also had to do with the actual popularity of the economic and political positions held by conservatives, including, for example, defenses of a harsh national security state, defenses of a particular kind of free market orthodoxy, defenses of various forms of racial reaction. All of these were popular positions within the society. And one of the things that happened let's say, over the course of the first decade of the 21st century, is that not only did the country start to shift demographically, not start to shift, but the country shifted demographically, but the actual positions held by the right became increasingly unpopular in the wake of the Iraq War, the financial crisis, the effects, the generational effects of mass incarceration. And it meant that by the time you get to, let's say, the Obama years, and especially here we can think about like the fallout of Romney's defeat in 2012, there's an actual question within American conservatism, and you can see this in some of the right-wing reactions to that Romney defeat about, well, what to do. It does not seem like the policies that the party holds can actually, on their face, maintain a majority coalition. You can't actually get majority support behind these policies. And how should you respond? And what I'd say, and we can get into this a little bit later on, is that the way that the party basically responded was not by attempting to create a majority, an actual demographic majority, cross-racial, behind something like a new conservative agenda, but instead to invest in the very specific tools embedded in the constitutional system to be able to maintain power despite having minority status. And this is really where the institutions of American government fit in. The US constitutional order is riddled with counter-majoritarian elements that really go back to the basic suspicion and opposition to mass democracy that the founders of the country had. And it means that because of the fact that the president's not directly elected, the Electoral College, a lot of this might be familiar, the Senate is based on state-based representation, the Supreme Court is not elected at all, but appointed through these two counter-majoritarian institutions, the Senate and the presidency. The House of Representatives is rife with gerrymandering and a winner-take-all process that actually undermines popular democratic representation. Federalism inhibits the ability of just mass popular opinion, shaping the terms of actual policy outcomes. All of this creates very strong capacities for a minority coalition to take advantage of these tools to be able to either dominate the Supreme Court, hold on to the Senate, or win the presidency without popular support. And so here are just like some stuff that you've probably heard from the news already, that only once since 1988 has the Republican Party actually won the majority vote when it comes to the presidential elections. Since the 1960s, the Democratic Party has been able to nominate and confirm a grand total of 4 justices to the Supreme Court. Trump, despite losing the popular vote, was able to nominate and confirm 3 justices to the Supreme Court. And then, of course, the rural city divide when it comes to the Senate, where we're moving towards a situation where within the next decade, something like 70% of the population is only going to be in 15 of the states. So all of these create incentives to pursue minority instruments. And what the Republican Party basically committed to as what is today maybe an essential part of the basic identity of the party is to attempt to use voter suppression, voter fraud, and these minority instruments to shape a voting population that can ensure it remains in power regardless of whether or not it actually has majority support. And it means that at root today, an almost constitutive element of the emerging modern rights identity is a kind of an existential opposition to democracy. And in that ways, it means that the party has become itself an existential threat to democracy. Now, why is this the case? And I think this gets back to the second history that I'd like to just, very quickly work through. So why was this the choice? And I think that has to do with certain bedrock features of the American political DNA that are being, engaged with at present, but until very recently were never properly or adequately discussed. And that's the extent to which the country is grounded at root on a very particular project in history of what I call settler empire. In other words, that the country was organized as a place for a small set of Anglo-European insiders to be able to enjoy political self-government and economic independence, grounded in native expropriation and the use of coerced labor, especially by enslaved African persons and other non-white immigrant communities. For example, we can think of the Chinese in the late 19th and early 20th century. And this meant that internal equality, internal quote unquote democracy from the founding was always built on a broader politics of authoritarian reaction and violence. And it has been a continuous sort of embedded cycle within American life. And it's implicit in the idea of who counts as genuinely American, and the ways in which who counts as genuinely American has been racialized from the founding. And you can see how this plays out in the context of the Constitution. So during the antebellum period, the Constitution, as a document for precisely the ways in which it was counter-majoritarian, actually sustained politically, practically, the power of slaveholding elites through the role of the Senate, the Supreme Court, the presidency. If you just look at who dominated the presidency over the first half of the 19th century, it's overwhelmingly enslavers and slaveholding interests. The capacity of state-based representation in the Senate similarly meant that you had gag rules that inhibited the ability to address questions of slavery. The Supreme Court is dominated similarly by slaveholding interests, sort of embodied by the Dred Scott decision in 1857. And what's significant about this is that constitutional mechanisms expand the effective sovereign power of a particular and racialized economic elite in the US. But at the same time, it meant that whenever that power was threatened, there was also a willingness, in a sense, in the language of the Constitution, to respond through violent reaction. You can even think of secession, Southern secession. One of the things that's really interesting about Southern secession is that the Constitution that the Confederacy wrote is almost identical to the actual federal Constitution, except for an explicit defense of slavery. And so secession is a form of violent reaction to the slipping or losing of a particular form of racial and economic power, is both lawless and violent, and understood as a defense of constitutionalism. And you can see this play out at different moments in American history. So it plays out in the Southern white response to Reconstruction, which is both a period of intense violent reaction, racist violence highlighted by lynching and other forms of extra-legal violence, but also explicitly defended in various ways as grounded in support for the Constitution. But even when not explicitly defended as constitutional, such violence is made difficult for the national government to respond to through the actual mechanisms of the constitutional order, particularly federalism, arguments about states' rights, the structure of the Senate, that make it very, very hard to actually intervene and respond. So in the first third of the 20th century, it's the structure of the Constitution that makes having an anti-lynching bill actually make it through Congress almost impossible. It's the language of the Constitution in the 1950s and 1960s that promotes arguments about, for example, faithless electors in the South, so that in the 1956 election, if somebody like Adlai Stevenson ends up winning the presidency, that maybe you use the intricacies of the Electoral College in order to subvert or stop that election. It's the language of the Constitution, for example, that ends up subverting the Voting Rights Act in 2013 with Shelby County, the Supreme Court decision that ends up striking down the constitutionality of Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. So that there's this clear relationship between the defeat of democracy, sometimes violently, and the argument that either this is on behalf of the specific constitutional order, or you're using the mechanisms of the existing constitutional framework as a way of subverting democratic authority. And so what does that mean for the present? I think the thing that it suggests is that we shouldn't view the attack on the Capitol as just sort of like lawless mob violence that's not either promoted ideologically by the minoritarian, instruments embedded within the Constitution, or as not having this very interesting kind of dialogic relationship to arguments about constitutionalism. That American constitutionalism is both creating the tendencies toward minority rule, while at the same time is giving a kind of cover to an ongoing lawlessness that exists in American life. And so what does that suggest going forward? I mean, I think it means that one of the most important tasks for the present, the immediate now, is not just impeachment, prosecution, the removal from office and the barring from running from office of various figures in the far right, but a genuine commitment to democratizing for the first time, truly, the American institutional landscape. And so it's key in the present that a number of policies, platforms that you've heard of actually be, given significant weight and in fact implemented, from statehood for DC to HR 1 that would address campaign finance, felony disenfranchisement, impose various kinds of court reforms, deal with gerrymandering, to alterations to the structure of different representational units in the House of Representatives, like moving toward things like proportional representation, to broader conversations down the line, not just about eliminating the Electoral College, but about figuring out ways to simplify the amendment process and create greater actual democratic control over constitutional decision-making. What's interesting about the present is that to the extent that the Republican Party seems now increasingly, almost existentially opposed to democracy, it's the case that democracy itself has become a seemingly partisan issue. And it means that there is a broad and emerging kind of consensus across the different factions within the Democratic Party, from left to centrist, about the importance of these democracy reforms. I think this is actually a positive development. I hope it signals the fact that there's going to be willpower behind implementing these kinds of reforms. It creates a context in which they can be pressed for. But it also, I think, means that it's important to separate intellectually and politically between the kinds of rationales that might drive centrist defenses, so establishment Democratic Party defenses of these democracy forms, and what a kind of leftist defense of these reforms would be. For a centrist position, these reforms are essential because they're technocratic fixes to an existing constitutional framework that's been undermined by Trump. And my view is, I think this is the wrong way of thinking about it, which is Trump is in fact an embodiment of an embedded and authoritarian tendency within American politics that's always been given, amplification and fuel by the constitutional system. And so that's like a wrong analysis. But it's also important to appreciate the extent to which the reason why these reforms are necessary, besides democratizing institutions, is that they begin to alter the actual balance of power within society. In other words, they provide those that are most oppressed and marginalized with greater material, cultural, and political resources to press for their own interests. And in this way, such reforms are not just quote unquote reform, like traditional reforms, they're also what we can think of as non-reformist or revolutionary reforms. In other words, they're part of the story by which we shift who in fact has sovereign power in this country. And that at root is the basic issue facing the US, which is how do we create a society where it's in fact those that have historically been marginalized that can exercise the economic, political, and state power to pursue their own interests and ends? And how can we improvise from within the existing landscape of institutions a new social order that allows those groups, rather than the communities that have historically been empowered, to actually create political outcomes that are committed to equal and effective freedom? So I'll stop there.
Thank you. We'll turn to Sheila now, and I forgot to mention this, but you can use the Q&A function on your screen to submit your questions, and we'll take them after all three speakers are finished. Sheila?
Thank you, Adom, and thanks to all of the organizers of this event, and Aziz and Astra. It's delightful to be sandwiched between the two of you and figure out what of my own take on this season in American public life is most worth sharing with the rest of the group. So a little bit of emphasis on the disciplinary backgrounds that the three of us come from and where that situates me in relation to maybe Aziz. So I too have a law background, but for much of my career, I've been standing outside the law and looking in, and hence have a particular take on constitutionalism that has tended to diverge from the kind of idea of constitutionalism and the kinds of debates that go on when you're sitting inside the perimeters of a law school, and hence necessarily looking at the Constitution through the lens to some degree of formal law and formal litigation and cases and what people do in courts and so on and so forth. So one of the larger themes I gather of this series of conversations is really about where does politics happen and how do flavors of politics coalesce to produce or hinder larger amounts of something called justice, social justice, from coming about in the world. I mean, I think that is something that all three of us probably coalesce around, and all of the organizers here too. But it's a more complicated question, I think, than one might get to by simply using words like constitution or democracy as if we know what those things mean. And even left and right. So, you know, if you take 2 steps outside the perimeters of this country, many, many people will tell you that America does not have a true left. I mean, this is something that I'm sure you've heard. So one could spend a whole series of teach-ins on that very observation, you know, that European centrists even think that there is no difference between Democrats and Republicans in this country, because when it comes to large institutions such as Wall Street, there has been no serious difference between the parties. And so, you know, something like 90% of the electorate may actually, you know, be fairly far right if you take particular issues like healthcare guarantees around which American politics have coalesced, or even women's rights. I mean, you know, some very, very fundamental things could be argued that American politics, all of it, right, left, and center, is tilted more towards the right in comparison with other countries that are equally rich and equally liberal in some sense. So from an STS scholar's point of view, an STS scholar looks at these categories and wants to know something about where they originate, where they come from, what gives them their stickiness. And for an STS scholar who's also interested in social justice, once there is a recognition that particular definitions and understandings of a term, a foundational term like constitutionalism or democracy, is in place, the question then becomes what to do about the obduracy of that particular understanding if it is not leading to social justice. So take democracy, for instance. You know, there is a big difference between American democracy and democracy as it's practiced in almost any other country with comparable degrees of wealth. I've been running for the last 10 months a very large comparative study of policy responses to COVID. And if you look at all of the European countries that are represented in the study, I mean, forget the Asian ones, which deserve mention on their own as representing something quite different. If you look at the European countries, one of the things that you see is that the take-home lessons of the 2008 financial crisis in much of Europe has been quite different from such take-home lessons as have been adopted in America. One of those lessons, most purely exemplified in Germany, is that you're better off in the long haul maintaining relationships, and in particular, the employment relationship. And this is not only because a lot of welfare benefits are channeled through employment, but also because employment is felt to be part of the subjectivity of the individual, that one of the easiest ways to undermine ego and undermine the agency of the political subject is to deprive that person of any capacity to work. And therefore, the stimulus packages in most of Europe, honed by the responses to the 2008 financial crisis, have gone toward preserving jobs and relationships in the workplace. Whereas we have decided to put money into individual pockets, and even our left-leaning economics colleagues, I'm surrounded by them in the Kennedy School where I teach, and they're left-leaning almost by definition in this country because the vast majority of them are Democrats. They don't actually believe in the European solution. They will argue very vehemently that what you do if you preserve those employment relationships is in effect give bad subsidies to people, because you're preserving companies that perhaps deserve to be uprooted and replaced by something new that's more competitive, the antitrust mentality that this is the way you deal with constellations of power in the private sector, those kinds of instincts come into play. And you hear very prominent people like former secretaries of the Treasury and so forth from the Democratic Party arguing quite vehemently against the kinds of solutions that European democracy seems to think are pretty central, I mean, pretty fundamental to the preservation of their particular forms of order. Now, I am not a holder of briefs for any flavor of democracy. The point is more that there are flavors of democracy, and we sitting in America have to ask, well, which flavor are we fighting for when we look at this moment of crisis and try to decide, well, what is the world that we want to come out to at the end, if there ever is an end, to this crisis period. And I would stress the if there ever is an end. I was a little bit thinking ironically of this term post-election or whatever. Post what, one wonders, when, the most recent video I saw by the current president of the United States interestingly used the word movement instead of the word party and put many first-person singular pronouns in there in that video. And I don't know how self-conscious that was. I mean, self-consciousness is not part of the subjectivity of this president as one typically analyzes it, but nevertheless, it was a kind of precursor, a preview of how this man actually foresees his future beyond the present day of electoral politics. And there's every reason to expect that some of the subterranean forces that, or historical forces that Aziz has laid out so eloquently and that are extremely important will actually continue. And there is no post, there is only the current of the present and how it continues into a future that is linked to a past. And the thing that we should look at is who has the power and who has the resources and the wit and the understanding of these forces to be able to coalesce and bend them in particular directions. I mean, in that sense, I think democracy is a field of possibility in which the tools and instruments are sitting there for people who can sense this flow of the stream of the moment and do the channeling, act as the engineers. And from that standpoint, I think the Constitution is just one of those resources. And from my standpoint, there is a question of, will the real democracy in America please stand up? Because to me, sitting where I sit in one of the world's elite institutions, teaching the future people who are going to be leading in America, my school's motto is that we train the leaders of the future. I wonder what it is that we are actually teaching them. So constitutionalism, I mean, one of the things that one immediately sees if one is an STS scholar is that if you take a functionalist and very broad-gauged interpretation of the Constitution or of any Constitution, as a set of norms that enable and constrain large collections of people. Some of it may be written. After all, the oldest constitutional democracy that we have prides itself on having an unwritten constitution. There is an irony in the fact, if you've done a lot of comparative politics, that the country with the unwritten constitution, Britain, actually has more things that they call constitutional crises than we do in America, where we claim to be the world's most robust, longest standing constitutional democracy. So, what is written and what is unwritten, I think, deserves our analytic attention if we think of constitutionalism as being one of the rhetorical, discursive, instrumental devices with which we coagulate forces to channel our democracies in one way versus another. What's missing in a lot of legal constitutional analysis is an understanding of historically what has happened since the industrial revolutions, that some ways of coagulating people and their consciousness, their self-understanding, and their subjectivities are coming not from law, but from science and technology. Now, it's never one or the other, because to some extent, what science and technology are able to bring into our world is always intimately tied up with what the law allows or disallows. For instance, at the turn of the 21st century, we saw the rise of a new elite of robber barons in effect, a new kind of extractive economy. I mean, today, one of the terms that's widely current is surveillance capitalism, because Shoshana Zuboff has written a best-selling book about that. But it's not just surveillance, it's a kind of extractive capitalism that's not much different from Cecil Rhodes and mining, and not much different from capturing airwaves or railroad tracks in earlier periods of history. Only now the things being mined are each of us. And the product of that mining is data. I mean, of course, I live in the heartland of universities, but Aziz, you do too. And at Cornell, you have one of the biggest centers of computing and major computational facilities geared and oriented toward subordinating the world to this new way of understanding who people are and what you can do with them, to them, about them, how you can move them around, and so on and so forth. If you think of just the simple word equality in the last, 20 or so years, Mark Zuckerberg had no money in 2000. He was barely weaned in 2000. And today he can be one of the top, is it today, sixth or fifth or fourth richest persons in the world. So how did that come about? Why is it that 5 people, or some days it's 6, together own the wealth of half the people in the world? I mean, so to some extent, it is that legally we have enabled a constitutional order to come into being in which we all willingly give up a certain fragment of ourselves. It's widely recorded and reported, for instance, that people under 30 today have a very different idea of what privacy is. I mean, they can't even imagine that giving up all of their shopping preferences is really giving up, under the guise of consumer liberty and freedom and being a good economic agent, which always made you a good political agent in America as well, that they're actually giving up anything of value whatsoever. And yet, obviously, it does have value, because then it coalesces and makes for a world that is heavily tilted toward certain forms of wealth, certain forms of accumulation, certain forms of what one desires. Who do you want to be? I got a little message just yesterday from a would-be student in one of my classes, which described how this person had been involved in a startup, in the life sciences sector. I mean, this is an 18-year-old, who has already sold off a part of a company. And, I wept inside. I mean, what is it that we have trained people to be and become in this world? So to me, these knowledge institutions and their industrial spin-offs and their corporate manifestations are part of the constitutional order that are ordering us, our identities, our behaviors, our field of possibilities, every bit as much as the written constitution. And yet it's not acknowledged. It only flashes up out of the pan in little bits and pieces. And, and Elizabeth Warren, who does not get the nomination, says that it's time to break up these monopolies. But then even she is talking in terminology that is, to some degree, old world. I mean, it's not 21st century terminology. We're not talking in terms that say that we are at one and the same time citizens of multiple polities, some of them explicitly constitutionalized. So at some point in my life, I had to make the decision to change my citizenship. It was not something I wanted to do, but in order to be able to cross territorial borders, which do have reality, I essentially had to get a different passport and, then therefore become a citizen of a different polity in effect. So those things are written in some sense, but we're also, all of us, living in an unwritten constitutional order, and that is the one that is dominated by science and technology to some degrees. So these, at least these two constitutionalisms and their parallel existence have to be acknowledged, to my mind, in order to have any reforms moving forward. We have this term coastal elite, but coastal elite doesn't capture what makes the bi-coastal population elites in some sense. What are the ideologies and the belief systems of these groups vis-a-vis fact and evidence and proof and right discourse? What is the right way to talk about things, against which the populists of today are rebelling? Until we have a more reflexive understanding of what it means to be living in these two different kinds of constitutional orders that interpenetrate and how they shore up one another, I don't think we're going to get the kind of reform that I think my colleagues on this panel both want, and I think that I share that too. In a way, we need to loop back, I think, to the first conversation that you mentioned, because it's a matter of resituating the American flavor of democracy with its warts and all, and its genuine achievements, against other ones that have chosen to divide up the linkage between constitution, democracy, knowledge and enlightenment into very different forms of packagings, and look at those trade-offs to some extent and create a new sensibility about who we want to be as a collective. I mean, you know, what is missing in the storming of the Capitol is any counter narrative. What is it that people stand for? And they say the assault on American democracy, but there's no analysis. It's just saying, look at this dome and it is American democracy. Okay, it's a fine piece of architecture, but that's not enough. We need to get back into the bowels of it and excavate what its underpinnings are. And I think that that is a major, interesting, ongoing project, and I welcome the opportunity to have even a little bit of say in that project. And with that, let me hand it back to you.
Great, thank you. We'll close with Astra now. And again, I remind you to use the Q&A function to submit your questions to the panel.
Hi, everyone. It's such an honor to be here, to learn of your work, Sheila, and to see you again, Aziz. Thank you, Adom, for inviting me, to everyone who's here. So trying to build on what these two brilliant people have said, I guess first I'll situate myself. I am a writer, occasional documentary filmmaker, and organizer, as my bio said. So I'm not exactly, I'm not inside the electoral system. I'm not inside the academy, but I sort of think and work with both of those institutions. And what I've been focused on, and what I believe I will focus on in 2021, are democracy and debt have been two major issues for me. I wrote the book Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone, which I still think is a pretty apt title. And resonated very deeply with Sheila's question, about the word democracy and the confusion contained in it. That's why the companion film was called What is Democracy? It was precisely to kind of trouble that word, right? To show that we have all of this, we have reverence and confusion at once about this term. And then I try to organize a militant debtors movement and that is all about trying to open up a new avenue for creating solidarity, for creating class consciousness, and for people coming together to make demands of this state. So I think since the question of the Constitution has been a theme, there's sort of two meanings in that word, right? There's both a written charter, but then there's also the spirit, the vitality, the health of something. And so as an organizer, it's in a way about that second meaning. You're trying to create a kind of civic spirit so that then we can transform the system, the political system we live under. And I suppose the other thing I'll say on that front is that it's quite interesting. I part of what's drawn me to Aziz's work is the emphasis on the minoritarian character of the American political system. And so that it's sometimes mythologized, right? People will say, well, the American political system, the US political system is all about protecting minority rights. Which minority? The rights of the rich, of the opulent, and against who? The propertyless and the debtors specifically. So if you go back to those men who wrote the American Constitution, they were very concerned about people like me. Madison specifically warned of the wicked project of debt abolition. And so there's always a sort of thrill there, right? And being the worst nightmare of some of the founding fathers, basically they feared the idea that a movement of not just impoverished, but indebted people would rise up and say, these debts are illegitimate, they should be erased, and we should have a share of prosperity. And they had reason to fear this because when you go back and you take the long view, debtors movements and democratic movements have often coincided. There's a long history of debtors revolts coinciding with advances of what we call democracy, going back to ancient Rome, ancient Greece, but onwards. And so there's a history there that we're quite conscious of, even if we emphasize later developments, typically in our analysis and our organizing. But I just want to remember that we're mortifying those founders with our efforts. So I want to talk a little bit about democracy and then some more about debt. I want us to keep in mind what happened on Tuesday when the two Democratic candidates won those races for the Senate in Georgia. And that's the contrast to what happened on Wednesday, the violence at the Capitol, right? I grew up in Georgia, in Athens, Georgia. And so it was really quite moving for me to see those victories because those were candidates that ran very liberal campaigns. Ossoff in particular ran very boldly on debt cancellation. It was one of his main sort of themes, and he had printed materials emphasizing debt cancellation. And so there's this, it sort of dramatizes these two paths: multiracial democracy or minoritarian rule and violence. And how did we get here? I think really quickly, I just want to say and that I think we're in. It's hard to say we're post anything, but I think we're post Cold War. We're in a moment. This really crystallized for me while I was going around and doing interviews for my film, What is Democracy? So I was interviewing people around at the end of 2015 through 2016. The last day I filmed was the day after the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And that day I sat with a group of young Republicans in North Carolina. They were undergraduates. And they were very gleeful that their preferred candidate had won. And they were incredibly conscious of the fact that they won because of these minoritarian structures. They were raving about the Electoral College. They were very contemptuous of democracy. They mocked the word. And they basically said, someone has to be on top. And what they crystallized for me as we talked is that, the Cold War framework was American capitalist democracy versus Cold War communist unfreedom, right? So capitalism and democracy reign triumphant, and there's this idea they go together, but actually they're splitting apart. And what these young people were saying essentially is, we choose capitalism over democracy, and they understood that democracy actually really does mean a redistribution of wealth and privilege, and they were again. Incredibly contemptuous of that idea. I mean, there was one point when a young man just said, democracy is this buzzword, but we don't want liberal cesspools having a say, And so that for me, it was my first person-to-person encounter with people holding those views. And these were educated kids, very upper middle class, affluent kids. And this was their view. And I think you see it really widely now. You see it when people say, we're a republic, not a democracy, right? I don't know if people saw the viral video from the other day of Capitol protesters, sort of Make America Great Style protesters. I think it was Representative Correa from California, a Democrat. They were sort of having an altercation at the airport, and these protesters started saying, but we're not a democracy, we're a republic. And so this anti-democratic attitude is, it's not hidden. It's very direct. And we see this in leaders like Mike Lee and Ted Cruz, who have even said they want to repeal the constitutional amendment that allows for the direct election of senators, right? These are guys who often say, we're a republic, not a democracy. And, I think sometimes liberals respond to them by saying, well, hold on, actually republic means a kind of democratic republic. Don't you see? It's just a misunderstanding. You don't know the history. And that's not, the point is there's a lot of anti-democratic stuff for them to draw on in the Constitution. Let's be real. And it's not about, it's a debate that's about power. It's not really about constitutionalism or originalism or whatever words academics would invoke. So this is, I was going to say some things about what Aziz laid out about just the sort of way that our political system, it's essentially our, political system offers what is essentially affirmative action for white, conservative, affluent rural voters. And the game is so rigged in their favor. They're just accustomed to it. And so I think that's part of what's laid the groundwork for them wanting to overthrow an election, right? When the game is already so rigged in your favor, why should you feel like you have to play by the rules? They're insulated and have been for a long time from having to compromise. And so one thing I want to highlight in this topsy-turvy world, and I think we have to guard against, is that what you hear is people like Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, Lindsey Graham talking about electoral reform. We absolutely cannot let Republicans own this phrase as we move forward. And so the things that Aziz mentioned, like HR 1, which is, I think it's called the We the People Act, are really urgent. I think what we need is a big popular front movement that is for, that puts electoral reform on the agenda. And I think we have a very small window to do this, right? The Democrats have the House and the Senate, the presidency. And if they don't pass some legislation now, I think we're really doomed. And so there is, to kind of ground that call, groups like Indivisible, Sunrise, Working Families Party, Rank the Vote. There are all of these groups now that recognize that and recognize that we have a very short window to focus on this. And this is something that all of the other issues we care about flow from. So I really support this effort. And I think we are in a moment where electoral reform could go mainstream. Things I would say about it, though, I think we have a bit of a messaging problem. We often lay out all of these things we need in the filibuster, statehood for DC, get rid of gerrymandering, we need to enfranchise former felons and so on. And I think there's something like people get lost in the weeds of it, right? And so part of how I guess I just want to say two things about, thinking as an organizer. One thing is, we need to figure out how we're going to frame this so that it's graspable and feels achievable. And I think about the reference for the slogan, one person, one vote. That is not something from the Constitution. That's not something written into the American fabric, something that is only with us post-civil rights movement. In fact, I think that phrase was first uttered by John Lewis at the famous March on Washington. And he actually said, this is the South African cry, one man, one vote. So it was actually a phrase that came from the ANC, from South African Marxists fighting apartheid, and from the labor movement. It was also a phrase from the labor movement. So we already, this is, and that phrase is still aspirational because so many people are disenfranchised in this country. But I think we need to push beyond that to one person, one equally meaningful vote. One person, one equal vote. We need to show in our phrases that we use every day that our system is completely distorted. And that even if you manage to have, we've been fighting so long for access to the ballot just to get people to vote. But even once you cast your ballot, it is an incredibly inegalitarian system. And so somehow we need to make that, I think, really clear. And by doing so, I think we'll speak to people's cynicism about the political system. Because one thing, this is my second point about organizing, is democracy reform should not be shrouded in sanctimony. And Aziz got to this when he was talking about sort of the liberal take on democracy reform. We need some technocratic fixes to mitigate the effects of Trumpism. People know that something is deeply off. And so when we say, we're going to restore our democracy, restore to what? You don't motivate a mass of people by saying, hey, do you want access to the system that you know is broken, even if you don't quite know exactly how? So I think that we somehow need to, we need to be able to be real about how broken American democracy is if we actually want to bring masses of people into the effort to try to transform it. And I think that, to this point about access, for so long movements have been focused on access to the ballot box. And we've forgotten that so many grassroots movements were focused both on access and at transformation, right? At changing the rules of the game. If you go and look at the history of Chartism in Britain, or you look at the way socialists organized for proportional representation at city and municipal, at the municipal level in the 20th century. I mean, radicals would engage with the system as it was, but then also propose ways of changing it. And I think we need to, we really need to get some of that spirit back. So anyway, I hope the 2021 puts electoral reform on the agenda for progressives. But you don't get to, I don't think you deepen democracy by only focusing on politics and elections and even, the electoral system. That's why I'm invested in debtor organizing. I think we need to recognize that democracy requires both political equality and economic equality. And so debtor organizing is my way. I think there's lots of ways of approaching this challenge. How do we redress the incredible imbalance of wealth and power in the world? But I think organizing debtors is a fruitful experiment, a potentially fruitful experiment. The idea essentially is that our debts are somebody's assets. The average American dies $62,000 in arrears. We have to debt finance the things we need to survive: education, housing, medical care. And so if you can get people to see their debts in a new way, both as a potential asset and as something, as this sort of tie that sort of shows them, like, you wouldn't have medical debt if you had universal health care. You wouldn't have $200,000 of student debt if you had free education. To form a new kind of subjectivity consciousness that can make demands of the state. And so I think there's a lot of promise in this moment. COVID, of course, has made the problem of indebtedness much worse. When you see tens of millions of jobs evaporate overnight, those paychecks are disappeared with them, and people go further and further into debt. There have been some, as we all know, moratoriums on evictions and some pauses on student debt collection. But the whole idea is, in many cases, those debts are just basically piling up behind the scenes. And so we're kind of punting on what's going to be an enormous crisis. And in this moment, I think we really need to say that it's not enough to give people cash, especially these middling sums. Now we're talking $600 and $1,400. But you also need to couple cash payments with debt cancellation, because otherwise any money people get is just going to go straight to paying their past due bills. And so there's incredible potential right now. We're launching a big campaign on student debt cancellation. I'm happy to say more. I invite people to look at debtcollective.org to check it out. But we've forced Joe Biden to promise to cancel at least some student debt, and we're aiming to push him to cancel all of it. So I think, I think this is actually, as perilous as this moment is, there are a whole lot of possibilities. I want to end with one thought, and that's just that I think we don't really know where people are. And so we're so disconnected. We often, go to these polls, 50% of people think this, 60% of Americans would like public health care, or 70% of people support student debt cancellation. We love polls when they affirm what we want them to say. But these survey results are they're not solidarity. And so that work of actually building the coalitions that will fight for democracy reform, or will fight for debt abolition and public goods, that will fight for a different world, is always going to be sort of intimate, difficult person-to-person work that's made even harder in a time of COVID, because it's hard for us to congregate and see each other, even though we need each other more than ever, because this is such a painful time. So I think that, there's just, as Jane McAlevey says, the great organizer, there are no shortcuts, even in a moment of crisis. If anything, our work is in some ways more challenging, but I think that that work of sort of building alliances and building solidarity, and realizing that polls aren't our destiny, is really, really critical. And so we make these big abstract claims and these historical interpretations, but ultimately it just comes down to person work to try to rebuild trust and to make people think engaging in these movements is worth their time and their energy, given all the demands on them. So thank you.
Great. Thanks to all of you. I'll read out some questions we have and encourage audience members to please submit your question through the Q&A box. The first one is sort of a long one, so bear with me. And it's tied to this question about, I think since 2016, the kind of specter of fascism has been, circulating, and obviously it's become more pronounced since last week. So Jake asks, Nikhil Singh recently said, if fascism flowers, it will do so with badge brandishing the Constitution. This is where it gets trickier, since the mob that came to Congress calling for military tribunals and summary justice view themselves as true bearers of constituent sovereign power and force of law. But careful assessment of this force is important, though dangerous. It's not close to taking power. This is why Trump's relative strength and weakness matter to the argument. So a kind of critique of the imminent fascism reading of that moment. So this is specifically to Aziz, but anybody can feel free to jump in. Could Professor Rana please speak a bit more on how the left should understand and navigate these dilemmas, specifically regarding liberal discourses of terrorism and potential dangers of further empowering the national security and carceral states in the name of cracking down on right-wing violence? And does the structurally minoritarian nature of the GOP expose an existential crisis to the right, as some has suggested?
So there's a lot there, and so as not to take too much time, I think maybe I'll just, give one response, and hopefully we can come back to this. So, I think it's really important to make sense of the difference between root causes and symptoms. And my own view here is that not the only, but one of the root cause of the contemporary authoritarian turn of the American right is the nature of the institutions. And precisely because these institutions give incentives to elites within the Republican Party, as well as the various organs associated with the Republican Party, to invest in minority rule, to imagine their power as something that can be sustained through voter suppression, and playing on the tools that are embedded in the constitutional system. And this is why I actually don't think that at present, the minoritarian nature of their coalition is in fact an existential threat to the Republican Party. Because if you just look at the election in November, it really wasn't a bad outcome for the right. I mean, you have generational control of the Supreme Court. They should have had control of the Senate. And there was a centrist, essentially neoliberal president from the Democratic Party. What one would have imagined, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why, that Mitch McConnell and others have been frustrated with Trump, is that you'd see 2 years of fairly divided rule when it comes to the Democratic Party, and then the possibility of being able to reclaim authority. And what this means is that the institutions, because they create these incentives, feed authoritarian tendencies within the right, the stuff that Astra was talking about, where they feed the tendency to believe that there is a fundamental divide between promoting democracy and maintaining power, and to say that whenever power therefore is denied you, that you can subvert the actual institutions. And this is the thought about how the constitutional structure actually feeds various forms of lawlessness. Because the thought is the Constitution basically sustains your authority. When that authority gets stripped in various ways, then you can essentially subvert what you think of as the existing legal system through various kinds of acts of lawlessness. And I think, the voter suppression is a form of lawlessness. Actual mobism is another form of lawlessness. And this is a long history, basically, of how a brand of authoritarianism has functioned in the US, including the responses to Reconstruction and the use of elected leaders that sort of precipitated mob violence, or used other forms of voter fraud, claims about voter fraud. This means that the particular thing that happened is, really destructive, and there needs to be a clear and strong response. But I also agree that it's important to realize the extent to which Trump was, practically isolated. So Trump has not been able to use the institutions of the state as a way of fomenting a kind of overthrow of the government. Instead, he's relied on what amounts to like, social movement instruments. And the folks that actually participated in the mob violence are a very, very small, actually like a small faction, that they're not particularly popular. And so I would be wary of a response that puts all of the effort on just focusing on what we can think of as like the symptom rather than the root cause. In other words, a response that just emphasizes Trump, that sort of reasserts like the language of terrorism to build up a national security apparatus. I think that's kind of a wrong turn. That like, yes, Trump needs to be impeached. I think there should be prosecutions. I think there should be expulsions from Congress. I do not think it's productive to further build up the national security state, because I think that generally ends up, blowing back on the left. And I think the primary focus should be on dealing with the root causes, and those root causes including altering the existing institutions so as to change the various incentives and essentially politically break the right as it currently exists. That should be the primary focus or emphasis.
Sheila or Astra, do you want to add anything on that comment, or should we move on?
Yeah, I'll say a word, which is, I mean, I'm a little bit suspicious of a term like root cause, because the metaphor of the turtles all the way down really comes to mind. Where do you stop the rootness and how far do you go? But one shouldn't judge the effect of the last 4 years just on the strength of the last 3 weeks. I mean, that was the sort of most pathological symptom of a thing that has been happening for quite a long time now. I mean, certainly since 2016, but arguably since 1980. And, so what those ties are and what American institutions are worth anyway. I mean, so we say majoritarian and minoritarian, but you could see the 4 years of Trumpism as an assault on everything that we might call an institution, whether it's the media or whether it's the judiciary or whatever. I mean, anything that you don't like deserves to be relegated to outer darkness. I mean, whether as fakeness or as lamestream, I mean, just the discourse that's been allowed to go on. I mean, who here takes comfort in the fact that Twitter decides after January 6th that it's going to block a person who, in effect, has been transforming electoral politics into populist politics, into movement politics over the course of multiple years now? Tim Snyder had his American Abyss article, which has been widely read. And while I don't agree with everything in it, one of the things he says is that when a person destroys the credibility of all other institutions to be the source of truth, then that person becomes an embodiment of the only source of truth. And, there's something there about how movements get made and even what the meaning of the term truth is. But certainly Trump has waged incessant war on those things which in America people hold to be repositories of truth, whether they're formal assemblages like the Centers for Disease Control. I mean, in all my years of dealing with science advice as a thing I study, I've never seen the sort of scientific regulatory bodies of the American government subjected to this kind of attack, even though the Reagan administration came in doing exactly that. The Reagan administration came in, among other things, targeting the scientists at the EPA as captive and hence needing to be on a hit list and weeded out and so on and so forth. Little known detail, his first head of the Environmental Protection Agency was the mother of Justice Neil Gorsuch. There's a genealogy there, but the second time around, it doesn't necessarily come back only as farce. It can come back as the pathological manifestation of what was only being dreamed of in the first incarnation. So I think that we have to take our histories back, and how we do it reflects the particular critical disposition that each of us has. And to some extent, I think it may be necessary for the so-called left, that is reformists of whatever goodwill, to actually try to consolidate these different understandings of what the root causes are and see whether our ideas of how to rebuild which solidarities we want to see and not see, can be refined and strengthened in a kind of crucible of critique, which our universities have done their best to dissolve. The takeover of all the social sciences by economist and quantitative thinking, so that history is no longer part of economics, for instance, just to take one symptom, and how we can rebuild the critical conversations even between law and STS, which is part of my life work. That is a non-trivial thing. I think we need to get back to the well springs of critique in some sense to be able to, come to a progressive movement worthy of this century.
I'll ask the next question. Caden asks, this is broadly to everyone, do we think, a number of you have talked about the various meanings that democracy holds, and Caden asks, do we think we need to throw out the language of democracy and come up with different alternative visions or pursuits? Or is there something redeemable about the concept of democracy or certain versions of it that merit it being a continued horizon?
So I guess, and I'll actually try to be quick this time. I apologize. So, I suppose like my emancipatory horizon tends to focus on the language of freedom, and that what I think the left should be committed to is a project of equal and effective freedom for all. That means the capacity of individuals to actually control the terms of their own economic, political, and cultural life. So both at work and in politics. And I don't see how an account of liberation that focuses on equal and effective freedom can be pursued without a commitment to something like democracy. I see these two things as really inherently joined. That in another way of saying it, and this is the argument that I think was made in the early 20th century by various kinds of socialists, from Eugene V. Debs to W.E.B. Du Bois, that socialism and democracy go together. Like, you can't really have one without the other. I think the problem, this is the idea of varieties, is that one of the effects of the Cold War was that the language of democracy, especially in the US, became reduced almost entirely to the particular form of constitutional democracy that the US imposed and pursued abroad, imposed at home. That imagined, as Astra suggested, that there was this connection between capitalism, a constitutional order that was riddled with various forms of counter-majoritarianism, and representative government. And that single model, I think, is the one that's basically proven a failure. A failure is a way of representing either people's interests or providing, basic kinds of social goods. And so I think, in a way, for me, like, part of the present is, how do you recover a much more expansive and genuine commitment to mass democracy and see that as bound to the set of, liberationist goals that we might have?
I'll build on that. I mean, I think when I began my film and book project on democracy, I was quite open to this idea that maybe we need to find another term, right? Or, embrace, there are other terms, communism, socialism. And I think the word democracy, I mean, every word is fraught. The challenge is actually doing this thing we aspire to. It's actually not the word that we're using. And I think especially in this political moment, because democracy is becoming so politicized, right? I think to say you're for small d democracy is actually a kind of a radical position right now, especially as we're seeing the right attack it. I would add something else. So freedom, equality, as Aziz just said, and the word I'm focusing on more and more, and I mentioned it, is solidarity. So just, in the French Revolution, right, it was equality, liberty, fraternity, but this word solidarity, and I think it's because of, my work organizing, it's a word that is, it's not like justice. It's not abstract. You always have solidarity in an interested way. It's always solidarity, with someone. And I think that's the other dimension that I think we really have to figure out how to shore up if we want to reach this democratic horizon. So that's my next book project. I'm co-writing something with a friend, and sort of there's very little intellectual work actually on the concept of solidarity when you compare it to the concept of freedom or the concept of equality or the concept of democracy. And I find that really interesting because I think that's part of what the challenge of this moment is. If we're going to have something that I think qualifies as democracy, it's how are we actually, then we need solidarity to get there. And there's been a lot of, there's been such, solidarity is something the conservatives or the right or whatever word we want to name them with have been very astute about sabotaging, right? There's all these ways in which solidarity, just like democracy, is suppressed. And I think we don't really have the tools to combat that. Definitely not at the scale we need.
So I too would not throw out the word. It's a little bit throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I think words that we live by to some extent are pillars of solidarity. I mean, that is a shared language. But to keep in mind that the demos of democracy is aspirational. I mean, you always have to ask, what is this demos anyway? And with whom do we want to have solidarity? Again, going back to, I mean, maybe the literature would be bigger, Astra, if you read other languages as well. And, it's not a word that has been commonplace in American life. But again, I would sound a couple of cautionary notes. I mean, I've come out this week of presenting some of our comparative study results in a group of American high-level decision makers, and they glommed onto words like trust and solidarity as if these are commodities and you can buy and sell more of it in the marketplace. But the last time people were buying and selling the thing that you're spending your life fighting against, Astra, debt and indebtedness, debt had been converted into the marketplace as well. I mean, the credit default swaps that are widely, given the responsibility as inanimate agents that brought about 2008, it was an understanding that once you took indebtedness and made it into a commodity, you could enrich people on other people's indebtedness. But it also embeds this thing called debt deeper and deeper into a technological structure, the financial system that functions in certain ways, with people writing the smart equations that tell you, when it's going to be profitable for you to invest in other people's indebtedness. Sometimes you get the math wrong and then you get 2008. But the point is that one has to define which forms of togetherness, and why is it so hard to get Americans to believe that a quote free unquote, but really a solidarity of education is a better system to have than the kind of inequality of education that we have with property taxes paying for schools, and from all the way down in the structuring of the society. I mean, why is it that the Monty Python scene in Life of Brian, where they're complaining about the Romans and what they did, became a kind of trope for Brexit? I mean, that is when people were trying to make fun of it, and they pointed to that scene in Monty Python and said, this is what the European Union has done for us, and people broke with it. Well, why did they break with it? I mean, what is difficult to understand about that definition of demos? That we're united in a common project. It's obviously something that is profoundly antithetical to a lot of American institutions. And, I think we have to grapple with those root causes in a way, Aziz. I mean, where are these ideologies? Where are these subjective positions being formed? And how far do they go? I do continue to think that the day somebody is born, they're not a Republican.
Okay, We have about 10 minutes left, so maybe we'll try to get to two more questions if we can. There's a question about thinking this authoritarian moment in comparative perspectives. What are some of the similarities between kind of the authoritarian strands in American politics, between Trump and other figures, Viktor Orban, Bolsonaro, and others in this moment?
Well, they are all men. While I don't hold with the analysis that says that the countries that have dealt best with COVID are the ones led by women, I mean, I don't think that's quite a root cause. Nevertheless, I mean, there is a kind of, I mean, yes, one can point to Golda Meir and Indira Gandhi, and, you know, there's nothing essentializing about gender, but nevertheless, it's a kind of, why is the strongman figure such an appealing kind of figure? But then these authoritarian tendencies have mobilized different instincts. So, you know, in India, and this goes back to one of my reactions, Astra, to your solidarity point, there is a kind of solidarity being invoked, and it's Hindutva. I mean, it's bringing together a Hindu majoritarian vision that is countering what is seen as a post-colonial legacy of a false kind of imported togetherness and solidarity being imposed in India, thereby giving the very large Muslim population, you know, a kind of identity that, you know, I mean, somebody told me the last time I was in India, which was shortly before COVID, that it was Modi's ambition to become the greatest Hindu prime minister of India, thereby superseding Nehru as a seminal figure. Well, Bolsonaro is not actuated by that. I mean, to some extent, Erdogan may have those kinds of ambitions in Turkey, which also came out of the 20th century with a legacy of an imposed secularism in a way. So I think that these authoritarian regimes have things in common, but they're actuated by different histories. What the leaders are able to do is to coalesce the grievances, which they do by some means that we know are common, such as control of the media, such as control of the legal system, the use of the panoply of the trial. I mean, you know, certain forms of performance that are shared. And, you know, it's been widely noted that Trump has been able to muster the aesthetics of authoritarianism borrowed from Hitler's fascism. So, you know, there are those things in common, but I think that the national histories matter here as well.
Yeah, so I mean, the thing that I would add is that I do think it's important to note that the dominant kind of governing model that was really, you know, tied to the US's emergence as a global superpower post World War II, even if it didn't actually exist in practice on the ground and the US subverted it in lots of different ways, was an account of liberal constitutionalism that tied market capitalism to representative government. And this was supported, this is, you know, basically supposed to be the premise of international institutions, and it was supposed to be the model of domestic statecraft that various countries pursued. And I think the story from '89 to the present has been the steady delegitimation of that model. And the fact, you know, highlighted by the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and the reality that this particular kind of connection of representative institutions, civil liberties, and market capitalism has basically failed across a wide range of states and societies in providing the, you know, basic ends that citizens want. And then especially against a backdrop in which this same period has seen the systematic repression and defeat of the left, also globally, it's not a huge surprise that an authoritarian right would be able to take advantage of these conditions. And so that to me seems like a kind of global story that you can tell, but I also think it's really important to recognize national differences. So for instance, you know, we spent a lot of time talking about racial and economic minority coalition in the US. If you tell the story of Turkey, I think that's a story of Erdogan very skillfully being able to wield a bare majority, like, but an actual numerical majority to then subvert the, the institutions of various forms of representative accountability to impose an authoritarian structure. So that's a different kind of national history that plays against the backdrop of the same global story.
Great. Maybe we'll take just one last question to close us out, and it's a big one, but I think hopefully one that leaves us on an up note. So Adara asks, if the attack on the Capitol is just the most morbid symptom of a wider legitimation crisis, which is experienced by those with and without privilege on the left and on the right, what kind of transformation is required to anchor a new, genuinely democratic polity? If that transformation is required to emerge from the very institutional order that is itself the locus of the legitimation crisis. So maybe this is a question about what the grounds for a different, a coalition or a site to begin this process of transformation would be, given that the problem here is the institutional order itself.
Well, I can take a very quick cut at that. I mean, one of the things that I found hopeful is that in the last couple of decades, people have started thinking about the future as a space of politics. It didn't used to be part of political theory, it still isn't. But to some degree, historians and others, critical students of science and technology, are thinking about the future. And I think that, even lawsuits like the Juliana lawsuit in the US that is asserting a right by young people to organize to claim back the future, coupled with a different understanding of human nature relationships. I mean, that there is a kind of planetary solidarity almost necessitated by phenomena like climate change, something that, as Greta Thunberg illustrates, young people are intensely aware of. Fridays for Future as a movement, Extinction Rebellion. I mean, nothing is to be taken on board without critique, but nevertheless, these are phenomena that are suggesting that people are finding a space of politics or spaces of politics, new forms of organization, people without voice suddenly deciding and discovering that they have voice. And even if 74 million people voted for Donald Trump, maybe we should take some satisfaction in the idea that more people voted in this past election, presidential election, and also in the Georgia senatorial election than normally do. So there is a kind of rediscovery of agency. And to the extent that people get depressed because structure is getting in the way, the rediscovery of agency, I think, is one of the sort of positive hope moments of this period.
So I was going to maybe just start by saying that I think there's a way in which sometimes folks on the left engage in too extensive practices of sort of self-critique and hand-wringing, though, I do it, so everybody, I certainly understand it. I think some degree is healthy. But what it sometimes gets tied to is this idea that the reason why forces of reaction or kind of centrist neoliberalism seem to win the day is because they're engaged in that, multi-dimensional chess, rather than actually there are these massive institutional and material advantages towards sustaining the existing status quo. And so frankly, you could be an utterly disorganized and intellectually uninteresting mob and be able to assert power, or you can have incredibly uninspiring candidates, frankly, like Biden, and win the Democratic primary. And that has to do with these advantages. And in a way, that's the thing that I think this moment requires overcoming. But what I feel like the left has, which is really distinctive and is in a way specific to this moment and different from really any other period in my own life, is frankly like the wind at its back, like the popularity of a set of programmatic objectives that are transformative objectives across the economy and the state. real generational support, especially among people that are younger, a commitment to ideas of like a class-based multiracial coalition. And so then really, I think the question of the present is how to transform this extra institutional power and, real kind of popularity of agenda into something that can in fact transform the institutions, make something that's extra institutional. And that's part of the reason why, I think that I've been focusing on, a democracy reform agenda, but I'd also say that I don't think that that should be separated from, thinking about things like the fight for 15 or universal health insurance or, debt relief or rent cancellation. Because in a sense, whether or not we're talking about changes to the constitutional order or changes to the economy, that really both together are principally about increasing the practical power that members of a left coalition would have to be able to wield against the existing sort of forces of the status quo. And so that strikes me as the problem of the present. It's a daunting problem, but I would certainly rather have the issue being how do you claim institutional power than the issue being, a genuine sort of demobilization of left ideas and left activism, which is something that we'd have seen, 30 or 40 years ago.
Esther, do you want to close us out?
I guess quickly, I think one thing I take heart from in this moment is that nobody thinks Joe Biden is a messiah, right? We don't have the same sense that we went into the Obama administration with, right? Where it was essentially like, yay, and now I'm going home. And then movements didn't really erupt until after Democrats had lost control of the legislature. So I think that that's a good thing. There's no sort of myth making there. And so we need to seize this moment. We have a brief window to push as hard as possible. I also hope that, I always want people to sort of recognize the amount of disruption that is actually going to be needed. And, I think the Obama administration was also, famous for hating activists and having this attitude of, these annoying, silly people out there who don't understand how politics work, right? And I think we have to get ready to annoy people who are, in the scheme of things on our side, more on our side than others. And really just push hard and understand that things have to be disruptive, they have to be sustained, and that we also need to reconfigure our organizations as social movements too. I think the part of this 40 years we've been talking about, this post-Reagan era, has been a kind of professionalization of activism. Well, also the trade union movement has obviously been under attack. And that needs to be reversed. We need to recognize that we also need to transform the political economy of social movements. I think the rise of groups where people pay dues and own their organizations is a really welcome development, because that's part of how we create the popular power and the sustainability and the accountability we're going to need to actually change these institutions.
Great. Thank you so much. I feel like this is a great way to end and a lot to think about and look forward to in 2021 and beyond. I want to thank all of our panelists and thank our audience for joining us for this conversation. Take care.